Welcome to Take the Hill. This is a leadership podcast dedicated to bringing you conversations with leaders who are influencing their respective industries. We're excited to have an incredible guest here today, Steve Adelkoff, who brings a wealth of experience, both domestic and abroad. We'll give you his bio here shortly. As we're looking at where we're at right now in terms of this global pandemic and thinking about what's going to be the next steps, I'm reminded of a quote from Clausewitz, who was a German or a Prussian general and military strategist way back in the late 1700s. He said, although our intellect always longs for clarity and certainty, our nature often finds uncertainty fascinating. And I think that's going to frame a lot of our conversation today because there's so much innovation and I'm not saying there's so much uncertainty, but organizations and whole industries are beginning to refine and reshape what they do and how they do it. So it'll be interesting in our conversation today to get some of Steve's perspectives and see where the conversation goes. So welcome to the show, Steve. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Doctor. It's a pleasure.
Well, first of all, we're going to have to tell you, just Patrick, that doctor stuff sounds really fancy. But Steve, I mean, you bring over 25 years of experience in all aspects of power and alternative energy and commodities industries. You've led teams in negotiation, both domestic and international transactions involving commodities, power generation, and development. You've done work in the renewable energy field, commodity exploration. It's such a diverse skill set, and then you even get into like the regulatory and tax accounting disciplines and risk. So your background is amazing. So we want to welcome you to the show and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It's a pleasure. Some of the information you had was a little historic. Let me start from the professional beginning. I actually was for 20 years first an associate, then an equity partner at the global law firm of K&L Gates. I was just the luckiest guy in the world to be able to learn what I learned and do what I did as a partner of that global law firm. But it seemed like everything that I did was at the epicenter of some kind of financial crisis somewhere along the way. So I became an expert in off-balance sheet financing, a la Enron. Well, my deals never blew up, but I was one of a handful of those that did synthetic leases, other off-balance sheet structures that I created. In fact, if you remember, we're in Pittsburgh. If you remember the old Four Systems development in Warrendale, that was the first off-balance sheet transaction that was done in the region using real estate. Yes, used to represent PNC doing it. That deal was I'm pointing. That deal with Four Systems was done by the old Mellon Bank. A lot of fun. And I moved into just wonderful, interesting things. Became an expert in Sharia alternative investments and structuring Sharia indebtedness and transactions so that they met the law, Islamically compliant laws, primarily for Sharia investors, including the Dubai government. Did international project finance when the 2008 crisis occurred. I did a ton of securitizations, CDOs, CLOs, the things that blew up the world. Only mine never did. Mine were all good. Represented a lot of investment advisors doing that. So all of that technology I loved and I knew. And my time at K&L Gates was just fantastic. But there a paradigm shift occurred somewhere in the early 2000s where when you started with a great firm, and not just a law firm, but also accounting firms and architecture firms. They were real professions, and particularly for lawyers, one got to exercise a curious mind and learn new things, and just doesn't get better than that for someone who has a curious mind. But as time goes on, it had to be more business and less profession. That's nobody's fault, just had to be. People had to focus on getting your time down, billing your bills, collecting your bills, doing the blocking and tackling to keep a global professional service firm going. Costs a lot of money to do it. And at that point, I said, for 20 years, I was with the big yacht and loved that no, it's time to go with some dinghies in the world, professional dinghies, and and did so. So 2009, I became the CFO and general counsel of a company called Sharia Capital, which is publicly traded in London, started by my dear friend Eric Meyer, actually in New Canaan, Connecticut. And general counsel and CFO of that. Then started a business with two other guys, a private equity firm where we invested in primarily power assets. It's called International Electric Power. Did some really very difficult deals, some deals that were so difficult they didn't get done, and then some of the most rewarding deals of my career. So the hard ones, we did a deal in Pakistan, tried to buy 100 megawatts of power in Pakistan right outside of Karachi, and what I call the sort of Fox Chapel of Karachi, very nice area of a otherwise very difficult place. Tried to do a deal in Haiti that was taught me more about corruption than anything you would ever want to know. I used to have straight hair, and then after that deal, it got curly and fell out. Our most successful deals, though, we built the largest solar farm in the Cayman Islands. And my 15 minutes of fame is that Richard Branson ended up buying that deal at the end of December of 19. So that was good.
Cool.
He bought it from the guys we sold it to. So I love that.
Awesome.
Yeah, it is. It is really fun. The most transformative deal that I did with International Electric Power was a deal in Panama. And Panama was very, very good to us. It was a very interesting deal. But really what was most interesting about it was after that deal, we had a bunch of money in Panama, and I needed to figure out the most efficient tax structures. And that required moving money around the globe, actually, through Spain, first finding appropriate tax treaties to leverage to get the most desired result. And then moving that money around. And what I learned at that time was that a skill set that is little appreciated and is going to become more and more important as time goes on is how to do the global flow of money. And that led me into learning anti-money laundering laws, sanctions laws, international taxation, and I knew some of it, but really started to become all the more curious about it. Today, I help run a bank in Puerto Rico called Fairwinds International Bank, and I'm the chief compliance and legal officer. It is a private wealth bank, styled as a Swiss private wealth bank, and Puerto Rico may be the last bastion of privacy vis-a-vis the rest of the world, not the United States. Fascinating stuff, where this whole thesis of how difficult the global flow of money is, and we'll get into the coronavirus, but one thing I truly believe is that the international fight for tax dollars is going to be a big conversation on what goes on post when we get out of the sheltering in place. So the one thing I do. Another part of the stool is that I have a private equity firm where we invest in smaller, interesting deals. One deal that I'm invested in is actually a company that distributes water in Saudi Arabia and Riyadh, hopefully to move into Jeddah. And fascinating guys, really, really fascinating guys. And I do my favorite hobby, which is teaching. And I'm honored to do it with Patrick. I do it at Rutgers University as well, online. I've just completed a global financial crisis class. How ironic is that? And yes, and absolutely loving. This was the first semester I got to teach with Patrick at Point Park, and couldn't have enjoyed it more. Really fantastic students. The leadership class but I of course bring the business ethics into it, and hopefully they don't learn anti-leadership with me, spouting off about tax fraud and all kinds of. I made them watch the Enron story and then told them those guys really weren't bad guys. I knew them; they were bad. So it's a hard argument to make. That's what I do.
Well,
Sorry for the
certainly.
long-windedness.
No, this is great. Again, from I'm always processing, so I have at least probably 2 or 3 course ideas for you next semester, uh,
Fantastic.
amongst a whole bunch of questions for you. So yeah, absolutely. And what was it? I mean, like you said, you had that elongated history with you, like you had said, with the yachts of the industry, right? So what was it like making that jump to kind of, as you said, the dinghies, right, where it's a little bit more uncertain, a little bit more, I mean, the path forward wasn't maybe not so clear, but I mean, you no doubt brought a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge, but yet it still had you grow and refine. I mean, what was that jump like?
Great question. So first, and I loved your quote
Thank you.
to start the
Oh,
show.
class with.
And it is so true that randomness defines everything in life. And if we don't think that, we're not thinking very well. Yet randomness is disconcerting. Um, it was very disconcerting for this lawyer to like sort of step out and become an entrepreneur in a smaller firm and what that might mean. Um, uh, One of the things that happened with it was that I prepared for quite some time. So I actually went back to get my MBA at Cornell um, in, I guess it was 2004, and spent 2 years doing that while also doing my practice at KNL. And my partners were wildly supportive of it. And that was critical so that I had a skill set that expanded rather than just being a lawyer. Being a lawyer is a great skill set, but it's just being a lawyer. Right?
Sure.
It's still women. It's fun, but it's just women. So going through the MBA program at Cornell was huge, was really huge, and allowed me to make it not quite as scary. Um, Frankly, it took a long time to devise the path, and a lot of that was negotiating with Sharia Capital, my friend Eric Meyer, who had been a client, and I helped take them public in London. We raised $350 million of Dubai government money to structure these Sharia funds. I knew there was enough money in there so that, assuming Eric didn't hate me, that things would be fine. I could get paid, and pretty scary. But I'll tell you what, though, I wouldn't trade it for the world. You really give. The younger you are when you're in an environment where you're in the yacht and you get to learn a lot, but the ship is stabilized, and all you're doing is growing. You're sort of like, first you're in the room where they serve the food, and you're being the busboy, and then you learn how to clean the rooms and clean the deck, and then you learn how to schedule the entertainers, and then you learn what the captain likes to drink, and you learn all of those wonderful things. You can only do that in that kind of environment with that kind of safety. But then when you plunge out, there's just nothing more exciting and fun and interesting. And you learn that you don't need as much as you think you need. That's not to say that it can't be equally as lucrative, but it is to say we all are scared that we're not going to have enough. And then you learn, you figure it out.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and you're right. I mean, again, it's great because you're learning so much and you're getting to see it firsthand, like you said, and you're responsible for what seems like a lot, but after a while, there's that diminishing returns, right? I mean, you have to stretch out, and then you find out, hey, maybe I did learn a few things along the way.
I'm sorry. Yeah, again, when it comes to economics, I'm very limited. It's not my forte, but I'm really intrigued with the international part of it and dealing with the cultures and so forth. I mean, what did it take for you to adjust your methods or the way you operate when you start dealing with all these different cultures?
Another great question. I'm not sure, by the way, that I was very successful at it, and that I even got better at it as time goes on. But I can tell you there's always interesting challenges. I spent a lot of time in Pakistan, and that's a hard place to spend time. And it was in 2013, 14, 12, 13, and 14. And and I'm Jewish, and they were all Muslims, and it was my role to come in and beat the banks up who had taken over this asset, this pretty bad, roughed up power plant. And by the way, the power plant it produced 3 million gallons a day of clean water, which is unheard of in Karachi. Water is really, really scarce. Clearly, what I learned is that it's not always so easy to get along with everybody, and sometimes just the ways that we do things are not the ways you should. And I kind of learned how to practice in New York, where we say, "Oh, Bob Longo," whatever we have to say, and that's not the way it's done in the world, not the way it's done in Pakistan. You really learn. It's actually a wonderful, humbling experience. And then one of the things that's sort of, I have a feeling will break my heart in the medium term post coronavirus is that travel internationally in particular is going to be so difficult. In a deglobalized world, I'm not going to get the opportunity to do it as much, and that's sad. It will break my heart. But yeah, a very difficult thing to do. Very humbling.
Yeah, so that deglobalized, environment that we might be facing, I think that's going to hurt a lot of organizations because, again, I think the opportunity to travel has taught me so much because it gives you perspective on the way that you're accustomed to doing business here in the U.S. domestically, and the way that it is and how much it varies globally. Even though the visions might be the same, the process is sometimes completely different. Like I remember being in Spain and talking with a owner of an organization and what is your fear 3 to 6 months from now? And he looked at me and he goes, I don't know if I have one because I'm making enough money. My family and my kids are happy. I don't want to earn any more money. I don't want to increase my market share.
Wow.
And it's the exact opposite of our capitalistic views, right? So, but I mean that idea though gives me additional perspective that I wouldn't have had if we were not able to travel there and go there, right?
So true. So true. And you've traveled all over the place, Patrick. You know very well.
Not as interesting as yours, though. So, I was probably still on the yacht if we're talking about paradigms here. So looking now, I mean, and again, you could tell me if I'm incorrect here. I'm looking at kind of maybe going back to the U.S. or even globally, kind of labor models and where capital resides within our economies, right? And if you think about it over the last 100 years, like you look at in maybe the early 1900s where workers didn't have the opportunity to build up capital, but maybe a little more wealthy folks have, and you see that shift even into like the 40s and 70s where workers gained some economic stability and they were able to put money away, and maybe the markets weren't as necessarily as good, as a little more imbalanced. Do you see that changing now, like in terms of that flow or that balance between folks who are able to generate capital versus those that are not?
That's a great questions. Let me throw out some observations here.
Yeah.
With all the sheltering in place, my life hasn't changed a bit. I mean, basically, my mother. I promised my mother I wouldn't tell people this, but I'm kind of enjoying sheltering in place. It's just great. It's a lot of fun, and many you can make you make your own fun. But it is true. I live downtown. I look outside of my apartment. The corner of Stanwick and Boulevard of the Allies, where the Archdiocese is, and the line of those who need food, who they do a handout, a little package every night, is around the corner. It's it's so devastating for those at the lower part of the pyramid, and it was devastating in the Great Depression. Right, we heard that. We see that in the recessions that came up, sort of in the ones that we kind of remember the most, 2001, of course, 2008. It's always those that are in the lower income category, have developed less skills, that get hurt the worst. And this is no different. And there's another big point that's coming up that when you talk about global financial crises, the two professors who are the rock stars in this are a guy named Ken Rogoff from Harvard, and Professor Reinhardt. She's now also at Harvard, and they wrote the book "This Time Is Different," which sort of does this taxonomy of 800 years of sovereign defaults. It's not like a Grisham novel by any means. It's pretty dry stuff, right? But now is a golden moment for them, and they're now out there really proselytizing that it's the emerging markets that are just going to get slaughtered here as as growth slows down, the world becomes deglobalized. We've feasted on low interest, easy money, and those sovereigns have continued to feast on that. And the debt will be denominated in euros or dollars, so they won't even have the ability to print money and print their way out of this. Not that that's good to do. It's going to be pretty ugly in the medium term with those that are at the bottom of the pyramid. But those at the top of the pyramid, sadly, I don't know, maybe it's not, however one feels about it, don't listen to them complain. I can't get my hair done. How about, do you have food on your table?
Yeah.
Big issues.
Any emerging economies that will come out stronger because of this?
Wow. Great question. I'm not sure. I wouldn't call Puerto Rico an emerging economy, but I would say this. Look, I think that there will be sort of enclaves that will benefit from just the changes that go on, and I think Puerto Rico and the Caribbean will be one area. And here's a couple of reasons why. If you have a choice to travel, ultimately we're going to be traveling again, and everybody has to go on vacation. People need the sunshine. They're going to go somewhere. They could get on that plane. They could go to Europe. They could go Asia, somewhere else. They're going to be more likely to go to the Caribbean because it's easier. And that's just one thing that's going to happen, which will be very useful. Although the cruise ships, I don't quite know how they survived this, but put that aside. But I also think Puerto Rico has really interesting tax advantages that just make it attractive. And in a deglobalized world, you're going to want to leave your money in a place where you have rule of law that you're comfortable with, like the United States, and it is a territory, so you have that. You could see some real benefit there. Otherwise, it's anybody's guess, Dennis. And I'll tell you what, I'm a huge Black Swan fan, and in part that means these guesses that we all like to have, and every morning and every evening I make my predictions. So stupid for us to
and I think and that's the uncertainty, right? And it's who knows? It is, thinking about those emerging markets, as much as we don't know, going back, we always looked at Japan and China as kind of those next big emerging markets potentially. And, you looked at Japan, and then what ended up happening there is their population sort of aged out, and then the focus shift to China. All right. But I mean, those guys are also in a similar position with a very aged population. And I think this morning they just released another enormous, job loss report there as well. So even the ones that we look at historically, as you said, are a little uncertain. So, I mean, what there's not really a good model out there right now, as you said, that it's going to say this region or that region. Maybe, like you said, it is the little enclaves that are going to kind of emerge that we may not necessarily have looked at before, right? And when they do, because all of us need to get out, right? Do you think there's going to be that mass movement, and then will their economy and their infrastructure be able to support movement? Like all of a sudden we decide Puerto Rico is the next hotspot, right?
It's a real problem.
What do we do there? Yeah,
it's a real problem. In Puerto Rico on the island, I had actually talked to a couple of hospitals about putting solar on and to defer their electricity costs, and uh, and the professionals that I talked to who are running the hospitals are just top flight professionals, but yeah, it's just a world of pain, and anywhere like that. The hospitals are certainly not the new brand spanking new global gazillion bed state of the art hospitals. They're just not. They're not anywhere in the world. And I agree with you. If there's a problem, those places can get overrun really quickly. And in a place like that, in the Caribbean, you've got this cruise ship problem where it's just nasty stuff just greening around the Caribbean, waiting for a place to land.
Yeah. And I think this morning, I think the report was almost 52,000 employees of those cruise companies are still stuck on the boats, right? So again, there's just so many challenges right now that they're dealing with. So since we kind of migrated into the healthcare discussion, so from your perspective, dealing with economies and wages, the healthcare costs, there's some reports out there, and I don't know how true they are. If you look at the annual growth of healthcare costs, some are saying that that's almost in a way have reached a peak. Right? Do you believe that that is the case, or do you think healthcare is still going to be a significant impact on our ability to increase our earnings?
I think one of the consequences of deglobalization will inevitably be some inflation. And I think when you have inflation, you're going to have more costs across the board. And I just can't believe that our healthcare system, which has continued to, have increased costs, is going to not have that in an inflationary world. And I don't think it takes a lot of inflation, but there's going to be. I can't believe there's not some in the medium term. It's going to cost us more. But I'll tell you another thing that's going to be scary, Patrick. And you hear, if you listen closely to our former chairman, Janet Yellen, of the Fed chair, as well as the current one, Jerome Powell, and Bernanke, all of them, Larry Summers of the former Treasury Secretary. I'm sure Steve Mnuchin, if he was allowed to talk, would say the same thing. Not sure Mooch is allowed to talk much, but if you look in the long term, 15 years, 20 years, we have a huge debt that we're going to have to wrestle with in our entitlement programs. So Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are the three biggies. And we're going to have to do something. Otherwise, one or more of them will be either bankrupt or will have substantially decreased benefits. That's inevitable as well. That's going to happen. Now, when that happens, keep in mind there's a lot of behavioral economics at play here. And when that happens, something called prospect theory comes into play. And prospect theory is this wonderful, very powerful theory from Professor Kahneman, runs Princeton Psychology Group, and a guy who's passed away, who didn't get to win the Nobel Prize, Aves Tversky from Israel. Basically, prospect theory is a marginal utility theory that says relative to a reference point, losses tend to hurt more than gains feel good. And that speaks volumes as to the risks we're prepared to take when we're in a loss position compared to a gain position. So the classic example is a stock trader who sees a stock go up a little bit. They love that, feels good. They want to lock in gain. They want to be risk averse. When the stock drops, it hurts. They're bummed. They're really not happy. Let it ride. We're going to make it back. Goes down more. Let it ride some more. And, a lot of these great studies have shown that stock traders should just ride it down to zero. Gamblers, the same thing. And that's all prospect theory is all about. So if our reference point is we're going to get Medicare, we're going to get Medicaid, we're going to get Social Security, and the government comes in and says, I got to cut that back, that's going to hurt. There's going to be a lot more risk that will be easier to take. I promise you, the president that's in the office when that happens will be out, right? Like a good throw in the hot corner in baseball, you're out of there. Yeah. Thoughts there? I mean, sort of.
No, I think you're right on, and I think the idea of prospects theory and behavioral economics actually play a significant role in there, right? Because again, we're the ones reacting. We're the individuals in leadership roles are the ones making the decisions, whether they realize it or not. Oftentimes, follow these trajectories. All right.
Hey, Stephen, I keep hearing that deglobalization, and man, that just scares me. I don't know. I mean, I've been teaching courses that it's all about globalization, and so if this is the future, I guess my next question would be, what steps will we have to take as Americans or as a country to be stable or self-sufficient, because we rely on so many countries for so many things economically.
It's so true. So this issue of deglobalization, together with a couple of others, I don't think that they started with the pandemic. I think they just got accelerated with the pandemic. So this whole sort of protectionist, America first, or my country first. It's not just America, even though our president likes to wave the flag and think there's some uniqueness to it. It's really gone all over the world. And in Europe, there's tremendous populist movement that's functionally deglobalization, I think. They just probably have a harder time doing it. But you're right, Dennis, and it's got to mean lower growth. There's other things out there like lower tax revenues too. But what does that world look like? Here's my best guess: that first we bring means of production back to the United States, even if it's redundant means of production. Supply chains shrink; they don't enlarge. So we're less likely to be reliant on Asia, Europe, Africa, and probably to a lesser extent South America. And that's one big thing that happens. And by the way, when that happens, now you've got a handful of trickling effect things. You've got to pay people more, right? Because a worker in the United States costs more than a worker in Southeast Asia. Yeah, that's the way it goes. You got an inflationary factor there. You've got sort of a retraining of employees. And we had a horrible jobs report today, and that'll take a while to sort of work through the system. But if you bring means of employment back, the good news is we're going to need more people to work. That's good. All of that's good. So you take that, then take another part to this, and let me give you another behavioral economic term. That's called the availability heuristic. And that says basically that when a sensational event occurs, people believe that the event will reoccur in a higher probability than the true probabilities suggest. So 9/11 occurred. For a couple of years after that occurred, I'd walk on a plane, I'd look left, I'd look right, I'd say, are we going to blow up today? And ultimately I'd conclude we're not. Or maybe we are. I'm going to have a, ginger ale and Maker's Mark. Say my goodbyes. That's going to be with us in this pandemic for quite some time. Everybody in the world is going to remember this and is going to think this could happen again. You're seeing it in you're seeing a fool's game on one side, and on the other side you're seeing this apply very strong. When everybody is saying, look, we're likely to have a recurrence in the fall or the winter, that could very well be true from a science perspective. When you think about the availability heuristic, we think, wow, that's going to be a certainty. And that's going to really send me into orbit, which is true. The other factor is you hear a lot of people say, let's get a vaccine and that's going to solve all of our problems. But the truth is it won't, because we will say to ourselves, that's nice that we took care of the coronavirus, but the next pandemic will be around the corner. We'll need another vaccine. Wear your mask, wear your gloves, don't travel, be careful. I think that those factors are going to influence us for a long time. That will create more deglobalization. We'll be on planes less, much less. We'll have less international business transactions. We'll bring more means of production back. The growth is going to be terrible.
So, when thinking about some of the concepts you're talking about, and it makes me wonder about our demographic here in the United States, domestically. We're blessed with kind of one of the younger populations in the developed world. So from our economic standpoint and their livelihoods, do you think, because of what's happening, they're going to have to work longer? So instead of retiring at 65, they may have to work to 75, right? Healthcare costs, pension fund obligations, interest rates. I mean, there's just so many variables there. How do you think that may change?
Who knows, right? Who knows?
Yeah.
But certainly there's a demographic that it may not be those that are 10 years old today, but there's some demographic, whether it's the 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds or 40-year-olds, that are just not going to be able to catch up in 10 years of very slow to no growth, and they'll have to work longer. Right? But I doubt when you shift the demographic a little lower, who knows? Maybe they can catch up, but there's going to be a group, right? That's going to have a tough time catching up.
So I'm going to give you dibs on naming that group. So we'll trademark it here. Yeah, it's just. Yeah, and that's where I struggle a little bit, because obviously our students in college now, maybe not so much impacted, but that group behind them, and you're getting questions like, well, how am I going to save for retirement? What are my interest rates going to look like? Healthcare costs. What is my pathway through what we define as success or our livelihood really going to be like? Because you look at the next generation's post significant events, all right, and it's always seems to be recovering, at least domestically, because we live in such a stable environment, right? And I think this is the first time where, as a country, we're kind of thrusted into something that is a period of instability. And as Americans, or at least from a domestic standpoint, I don't think we're comfortable with that. Whereas, even though it's still as devastating globally, I think other countries or other areas are a little bit more used to instability, so their response is a little bit more coordinated or better than what ours is right now, perhaps.
So guys, you've been asking me questions for 45 minutes. I want to ask you some questions.
Yes, please do. Go for it.
And by the way, Patrick, I think you're right. I love both of your views. Patrick, you and I have talked about this a little bit, but I would love both of your views on what does higher education look like in the short and medium term? Wow. That's the biggest. It's going to be huge to change.
I mean, I've had conversations with concerning that, and I get both spectrums that there's the many students, they want that experience and they want to be on campus and all that, and they'll get back to that. But I disagree. I think that parents are going to play a huge role in that, and a lot of parents are going to say, hey, no, stay at home. Look, you guys are doing it right now. You're successful. I don't have to pay for your a dorm. I don't have to pay for your food. I mean, we're seeing that it's a lot cheaper to follow this route. So personally, I think it's going to change drastically, and you're going to find that people are going to like this. I don't know, this experience of learning, distance learning. So I don't know. And I think a lot of the universities, even though it's costing them a large amount of money, but in the long run, I mean, you don't have to have as many buildings. You don't have to have as much electricity on and usage of water. And I don't know. I don't know what the future holds. I know that I teach for Penn State as well, and I know that their world campus, I teach for the world campus, and I'll tell you what, their enrollment just keeps going up and up in comparison to face-to-face or brick and mortar. So I don't know.
Isn't that great?
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, your comment's interesting about the parents. They have to really like their children to want them to stay at home. But
And maybe
Yeah.
some want to send them off, but
That's right. That's right. Mine would. Mine would say, "Get out, please go."
I don't know.
I would take a little bit more of a macro view, and if you look at it from like a systems theory perspective, most systems, i.e., industries, are always seeking stability. All right, so when you have these major disruptions, they're always finding ways to get back to the norm, unless there's such a catastrophic change, in that external environment that forces that internal structure to change itself. And I think we're in one of those defining moments right now. And on the pendulum of I guess agility, to change, higher ed has been almost like a slumbering dinosaur, for lack of other terms, right? And it's been able to weather a lot of those changes in the environment. But I think this might be one that is going to really deeply impact that in this industry. And I think, going into super specifics, we're probably going to be at a point where we're required to now start to really think about how we deliver our classes, what we offer our students. What does higher ed actually look like? Because if we don't, as you said, those who are more nimble or more willing to change, like you said, I think are going to be better off in the end. So
I think an example was this morning, the superintendent for the Pittsburgh Public Schools put out a statement that they're probably going to still do online because how do you do social distancing in a education environment in a classroom? It's very difficult. How do you keep a space between people? So, we already see people saying, wait a minute, how are we going to do this? We can't go back to the norm. And who knows for what time frame this is going to play out too. I think that's a key factor as well. How long is this going to be?
Yeah, and again, not diving too deep into religion, but what's the first thing that a lot of churches around the area did? Jumped right online, right?
Yeah.
So again, I'm pulling examples from other areas of the world, but it's have to change. So how did we do, Steve? I mean, do we answer your question?
You did, but I have more now.
Oh, please. Please go.
Let's hit on the religion part for just 1 second. Have you noticed that there are more commercials on TV related to religions, and now is the time to turn to religion? Well, whatever the religion may be, all of them are like now advertising more. Have you seen that, and what do you think about that?
I think that falls right in line with the 9/11. It just seems like whenever there's a tragedy or some kind of some threatening the way of life, people automatically turn to religion because maybe they embrace, or they're some type of security there, or some type of hope. I think that word hope is a big one, and people just get scared, I think, and they begin to do these self-evaluations and start thinking, maybe I ought to start thinking about the hereafter. I don't know. I'm just saying, it scares people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I always harken back to that quote of, there's no atheist in foxholes, right? So, yeah, religiosity and belief in whatever religion, I think again, it comes back to the idea of hope and humanity, right? And I think it's a really good thing, especially right now, because the more students that, even as guests that we've had on this show, they have expressed that belief that, before all this happened, I was booked 9 to 5. I had, gym and homework and school and job. And they've talked a lot about slowing down, connecting with families, connecting with friends, and actually enjoying that time. And I think religion and religiosity is one of those things that kind of force you to do that. So it's not a bad reminder.
I asked the question of the students at Rutgers, what good has come of this pandemic? And that's an example of it, right? Maybe we're slowing down awesome. And thinking a little more deeply.
That's I think good. I asked that same question to some of my students, and I was really surprised that maybe we see the family structure coming back. They're saying, oh, I got to know my family much better. Oh, I'm relating to my father as an adult now instead of a child, and they're getting to know the family again. So I see a lot of, I mean, there are some good things coming from this, but yeah, it's hard to say where it's all going to go, though.
So it sounds like you two are offering to babysit my kids for a few days.
Yeah.
Well, that's,
Yeah. Hey, I gotta go. See you later. I'm just kidding.
the insurance policy you'd have to take out for me would bankrupt you.
I love it.
You couldn't do it any other way. That would be. So how have the professors at Point Park generally? I've talked to a number of them, but what's your sense of how they've responded to this and having to go online and all of that?
Yeah, you know what? In all honesty, like you said, they are, they love refining their craft, right? So, they're teaching because they have a passion for teaching and being involved, in the student development as they are, right? So, the fact that they had to move online, again, for those of you who are used to being in the classroom, was a little bit, okay, it's not the greatest thing because, again, we love the face-to-face, but they all transitioned very effectively.
It scares me in my future. That was my niche. I was an online teacher for several years, and not too many people wanted to do it. And now everybody has that experience. I'm no longer how do you want to put it? Needed.
Well, actually,
not so fast.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about that because, again, the capacity is still there. All right. Yeah. So, we still need the same courses, whether they're taught on ground or online.
Right.
Enrollment might take a little bit of a hit. So, again, there might be a few less courses to run over the short term. But again, like you said, I think I agree with Steve, and if anything, it's going to have to grow.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree. Yeah.
And so so I also made the transition from in classroom, and you can tell how shy I am. So, it was a struggle for me in class. And then, moved maybe 3 or 4 years ago, started teaching online as well. And it's a completely different skill set, right? And how do you feel about that? I assume you started in class and then moved to online.
I did. Actually, I was totally against online when I first started teaching. I was a face-to-face, and that was the best way, the only way. And after I started getting opportunities to teach online, again, like you said, it's a different skill set. Actually, you work harder teaching online courses than you do teaching face-to-face. There's a lot more prep, a lot more material that you need to offer, and so forth. But I felt it was a great transition. I love it, actually, and I think if it's done correctly, teaching online is very how do I put it? It's a great way to educate somebody. I really find that if it's done correctly, it's very efficient and very rigorous versus some face-to-face. Because here's my philosophy, that in face-to-face, I found that many students, you only have 1 or 2 that really interact and really participate, and everybody kind of rides the shirt tails of those individuals. Where online, if you set it up correctly, everybody has to get involved. There's nobody riding on the shirt tails of others, and they're forced to be included in everything. So I think it's really it's a great tool.
I so agree with you. I've had to be more creative in the online classes than in person. In person, it just sort of flows, and there's we're left off the hook as this in a Socratic method as the students, and so.
Right.
But online, we're all naked.
Yep.
Yeah, that's so very true. So very true.
Absolutely. Guys, you answer questions really well. You do a beautiful job of that.
Well, do well as with your own podcast as well.
We're going to try that.
Nice. So, Steve, what other projects or anything that you have coming up that you want to share with listeners? I know you're teaching a couple classes. Anything else on the horizon for you?
Great question. So what is on the horizon? I'm very focused on this thesis of this global fight for tax revenue. I really think that how this will cascade is that with the stimulus and lower growth, sovereign debt is going to grow enormously. And there's going to be there's going to be less tax revenue because every time there's reduced growth, there's less tax to pay on that reduced growth. And sovereigns are going to fight for those tax dollars. The United States is particularly good at being selfish about that. The United States has a very uncomfortable relationship with helping other sovereigns collect their tax. That's what the Revolutionary War was all about, presumably. And I think going back to those days, it's an uncomfortable place to be. And I think it's going to define what goes on in the medium term, say from 18 months to 5 years. It's going to be, it's going to really divide nations. It's going to divide the international world. It's going to be a major topic of conversation that we got to watch out for. Can't wait for that.
Awesome.
About that.
Awesome. Well, we're, like you said, looking forward to staying connected to you. Certainly are going to plan, hopefully, if you are willing, to come back on the show again in the future. This is exciting. Excellent.
Would absolutely love to. You guys are fantastic. Yeah. Just a real pleasure. This is so much fun.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Really enjoyed it.
Okay. Final thoughts, Dennis. Anything good?
Wow. It was just like being in class. Learned an awful lot. About economics. Again, I'm still just letting it all hash out in my brain here. And but it gives me a lot of the things that we discussed. I'll tell you, thought-provoking. I'm going to spend some time thinking about some of these things. I didn't really think about all the ramifications, or especially this deglobalization. I really got to give that some thought. So it was very thought-provoking.
I'm delighted. When it's done, we're going to go have a beer and talk about it.
Yeah.
I love it. That's great. Yeah, and as you said, Dennis and Steve, I mean, there's a lot that's going to be kind of reshaping our new normal, over the next few months, and everything from behavioral economics to prospect theory to everything related to the tax consequences. It's going to all be interconnected. So it's going to be interesting to see. And again, we will certainly have you back in the future, Steve. So thank you so much.
I look forward to it. I really enjoyed it, guys. It's been absolutely a pleasure.
Awesome. So in closing, we'd like to thank again Steve Adelkoff for joining us here on the podcast today. If you reflect upon our conversation, and again, connecting back to what Clausewitz said at the beginning, when we opened the show, what we've really illuminated is the fact that circumstances are going to vary enormously and almost to the point where they're indefinable. This vast array of factors for us as leaders really has to be appreciated, right? Especially in the light of the vast array of probabilities of loan. As leaders, we are really responsible for evaluating the whole, and we must bring to task the quality of intuition that perceives truth at many points. All right, so it's not just going to be one report or one model. All right, we have to really look at it holistically. Otherwise, the chaos of opinions and considerations that are going to arise amongst your teams are going to create an unavoidable environment entangled by diverging judgments and opinions. All right, and that's what's going to make our job challenging. And it's podcasts like we did today with our guests with Steve that are going to add knowledge to our individual lenses. And to go back to quote Clausewitz one more time, he even joked that Napoleon Bonaparte rightly said, that when many of the decisions faced by those in leadership positions resemble mathematics worthy of the gifts of Newton. All right, so none of this is easy. This is complex, but it's our jobs as leaders to take the complex and make them simple. All right, not diminishing the complexity that each of these environments are going to present to us, but make it understandable for not only ourselves to make decisions, but the individuals that we lead. So in closing, we want to thank Thank you, sir. We appreciate it. So, but again, thank you to Steve Adelkoff for joining us today. We also want to thank the Department of Labor Relations at IUP, and as well as the Roland School of Business at Point Park for providing support to this podcast. And our technical wizardry behind the scenes, Angelo. Again, check out his podcast. Again, he's a pretty popular dude. He's got some awesome stuff happening over there. So thank you to all of our listeners, both here in the US and around the world. We truly appreciate everything that you guys are doing. Keep sending us questions, and stay tuned for our first video podcast where we answer your questions that were submitted. We should have that out here in the coming weeks ahead. So until then, be safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to talking to you guys soon.